indigenous peoples with abundance in contrast to scarcity. But that in the 20th century, that has changed, that they're instead associated with poverty, or that there's that association. And so this is how, in elucidating this labor-work dynamic within the context of the long 16th century, that these are letters from Las Casas and Columbus, who were very much important actors in this history of colonialism. I'm curious what sorts of texts or actors you would point to that elucidate this shift about perceptions of indigenous labor or the place of indigenous peoples within Caribbean society in the 20th century.
You want me to go? Munzer is interesting because he's implicated in the first great proletarian and peasant revolt of the modern world, what's called the Peasant War of 1525, which is a revolt against the extractive capitalism that had built up in Central Europe over the previous 50 years, and is a fundamental moment in the rise of capitalism, as fundamental as the conquest of the Americas. And so it's important to put that into play and to understand that from the beginning there was a radical communist opposition to turning everything into money. And indeed, that quote from Munzer, we all love it because it has such a contemporary resonance to it. The other part, I have this funny experience because depending on which audience I get invited to, I bend the stick one way or the other. So the question about underproduction is important because the questions of capital accumulation are generally in discussions like this, and we've seen this, pretty much epiphenomenal. Capitalism is sort of works out there, and so we leave its sort of God trick of capital accumulation in the black box. And we have to put that in with all the conversations we're having. Now I go and talk with a political economist, and I communicate the opposite argument about indigeneity, about environmental justice, about the racialization and gendering of labor and the colonial projects. But we have to take political economy seriously, and how does capital accumulation unfold? How has capitalism periodically reinvented itself and been compelled to reinvent itself through successive climate crises, popular revolts, other kinds of contradictions to capital? There's a sense in which I often find that radical audiences have the most faith in capitalism's resilience, and part of that is because folks don't want to engage the internal contradictions of capital. Oh, that's breakdown theory. Well, breakdown theory is pretty important. And it's pretty important to deal with the internal contradictions of capital, which are different from the contradictions of capitalism as a whole. And so the point about underproduction is important because Marxist political economy has assumed that the problem of surplus capital, that is, capitalism generates more capital than it can reinvest profitably, is always generally a problem of overproduction, and has ignored the question of cheap nature, including human work itself. And so in an era of climate crisis, we already know the underproduction crises are coming, first and foremost in the labor-food nexus that is at the heart of capitalism, that agricultural revolution model to produce more and more food with less and less labor power. That's over. And we know this now from the biophysical agronomic data on climate-induced yield suppression for the world's 4 big cereal crops. Now, so it's kind of a zombie agricultural revolution at the moment. The neoliberal agricultural revolution never went anywhere. It just redistributed power, redistributed wealth, without actually forging a new agricultural revolution. So questions of underproduction are fundamental. It's underproduction in a Marxist sense, not in a Malthusian sense. It's scarcity for capital. As we know, there's plenty of food in the world. So we have to attend very seriously to questions of how capital accumulation unfolds, even if you think it's somehow boring or your eyes glaze over or anything like that. We have to pay attention to how that dynamic works. It is not the whole story. It is not the determining story, but we do live in a civilization that is capitalist, and that is fundamental to how it reproduces itself. One part of it. It's not, I feel like I have to make these justifications. Look, it's not the whole story. Nobody's telling the whole story. So if you tell a story of something that happens in Guyana, or you tell the story of something that happens in the capitalist Atlantic, those stories are always partial. They're always situated. But we need to come to grips with the history and the kind of models of how capital itself, Marx's Capital is still worth reading because we have to understand capital accumulation. Not that it's a master key or anything, still.
For my part of the question, I don't think I fully got the second half of the question that was directed at me, but the division between scarcity and abundance is not one that is specific to or internal to how Blacks or Indigenous peoples ever organize themselves. So there has not been, there's not necessarily been a shift from scarcity and abundance now to poverty, but scarcity and abundance is, I think the sort of the necessary outcome of it is precisely that poverty that Sylvia Winters says has to be socio-institutionally produced for basically a vast range of infrahumans.
Josh, yeah, you're on the list.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm a student in the History of Medicine program here. So this question comes from the discussion last night, but also the discussion this morning. Amid all of the incommensurabilities and fruitful and constructive disagreements between the three of you, there is common ground that you're all speaking with concepts of anthropomorphized capital or capitalism. So capital does this or capitalism does that. What happens to the conversation, either intellectually or politically, when you actually start speaking about capitalists, the people involved? So it enables us to produce genealogies of like TD or Enbridge or Barrick Gold or whatever, but what happens to these discussions comparing universality versus pluriversality, things like this, when the conversation is centered around the people actually driving a capitalist system or capitalist economies or capitalist relations?
I mean, there's a difference of philosophy. The capitalists aren't driving the system. Marx has this great phrase, they know not what they do. I mean, we're all sort of reproduced. Now, there's contradictory processes going on, so we have the possibility of opening these spaces that we've all been talking about to contest and refuse.
Can I just ask, is that sort of maybe a question about responsibility? Because the Anthropocene posits an actor, right? And the actor is man, and the actor is bourgeois man. And it eclipses that, you know, how bourgeois man actually comes into being, right? But is the question about whether or not we can still think about actors when we talk about the Capitalocene and when we talk about the Plantationocene?
In a way, yes, but also just what sort of connections can we bring? So in like not wanting to speak in terms of globality, but also wanting to speak in terms of the multiplicity of worlds that exist. Is that at all abridged, or am I just attempting to smooth over the incommensurabilities by attempting to frame this discussion around human actors or organizational actors rather than the logics of a system?
I mean, I think one of the things that we've been wrestling with is the division between human and not human. So, you know, like the first thing I got kind of stuck on in your question was to see that we're anthropomorphizing when we talk about a range of kinds of actors or a range of kinds of activations. So that's, you know, one thing that I kind of first got stuck on. And then I guess, you know, when I think about TD Bank or I think about these companies, and you know, I tend to come at it from a tradition of reproductive justice and thinking about how worlds and relations get reproduced and what gets reproduced and what doesn't get reproduced. And of course that connects with forms of like, you know, Marxist thought and feminist Marxist thought, but also has its own genealogies about thinking about life supports and so on. So I think it is important to talk, like for me, to talk about Enbridge and to talk about TD, et cetera. These are, or whatever the various projects are, there's a kind of practical application in my work in that it's about it's about a place, and it's grounded. And the project of refusing some things and creating life supports in your community is like, that is ultimately what the project is about. Yeah, so I guess, I kind of feel empathy with what you're saying, but like not quite comfortable with the terms of the question, if that's fair to say. We can ask all sorts of things like who gets to be a person, what gets to be a person. When I think about responsibility, it's not just about like accusation, but like responsibility. Like my obligation, like trying to do work that's in relations of obligation and figure out what they are, which aren't about an individual. And obligation isn't about assigning blame always. So I don't know. Yeah, so it's hard for me to answer that question, but I appreciate where it's coming from. I don't know if other people have thoughts.
No, it's tricky, but I do want to just add. So, and that's my reticence with the non-human-human divide. I feel like if you deploy it, it has to be made culturally specific because I don't think it's universally applicable.
Yes.
And so that's why I don't use it. For me, it's a false distinction. So yeah.
Sophie?
We've already touched on a lot of these themes, especially Michelle has, but I wanted to hear more, especially from Jason, and whoever else wants to jump in on it. It's about the word radical. You make an appeal in the pages of the article you shared with us to radicals, and I want to sort of return to this question of who do you mean by that, and if we're talking about justice in the context of radical thought, on the one hand, there's a radical genealogy of thought that might be attached to a particular place, a particular tradition. But also with the idea of justice comes the idea of radical thought that's attached to a particular kind of future. And I think that it seems to me that you have a particular kind of radical in mind in your piece. So can you speak to your idea of who a radical is or who a radical could be?
Well, I think it's a great question. It's also in some ways a very dangerous question because it sort of sets up what's your definition.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a
Yeah, definitions. So it's a very it's a very sort of modernist question. I think for me I would say okay. Go ahead.
I just wanted to give it a little context for a moment. So you mentioned, I think, about the necessity of not ignoring the history of cheap nature in radical thought.
Well, that's.
And for me, coming from a Caribbean context, certainly theorists of racial capitalism and black thinkers of the Caribbean have thought about cheap nature a great deal, and in particular, the way that enslaved people fit into that paradigm.
And you're thinking of.
I'm thinking of Cedric Robinson. I'm also thinking, Haitian thinkers like Jacques Roumain, about peasants and agrarian change in the early part of the 20th century.
Do you mean to say that there is a recognition that there is a nature out there, and that it has been degraded and cheapened through imperialism? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aimé Césaire writes about that. And
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No. I mean, that's where I started, in that kind of a place. Yes, that's very important. Yes, there's long been that recognition. Cheap nature, though, is not the forests and the fields and the soils and all of that. There's all of those are great figures and inspiring figures to me, indeed, and I would identify with all of those. So is your point that the elements of the argument are implicit in a whole range, not just anti-colonial Marxism, but feminist Marxism, also labor history, all sorts of Marxisms, and all sorts of non-Marxist radical approaches, Kropotkin, many others around the world. Yeah, sure, the elements are clearly there.
Who is the concept for? Like, do you elaborate the concept if it's for radicals? Which ones? Like, who will it be useful for? For whom will it do work?
That's not how I think about this question. I think for me, we want to be. Lenin would say this. We want to be radical as reality itself. And so for me, that entails. And I think, we can leave the question of Lenin aside, but we can say, do we pursue a curiosity that is connective and connective, not just with disparate elements of reality. What we have taught are fragmented. Think of the disciplines or the two cultures. So how do we connect those? And then how do we historicize those? And how do we link those to emancipatory projects that are fundamentally connective? Hence, how do we move beyond, say, a productivist view of nature and saying Pachamama has given us cheap natural gas, in the words of Evo Morales. So for me, it's more of an emergent process. And I think that I'm uncomfortable with your question because I think it points to a very old way of saying, well, what kind of radical are you? And I think what we need to be asking is, what kind of radicals do we need to be in an era of planetary crisis that is a geohistorical and not merely geological and biogeological crisis?
Did you just, yeah.
Shona
Oh, I'm sorry, Shona. I'm
Well,
sorry.
It doesn't quite relate to your question. I'm trying to sort of tie together something else, so I can wait until the last question to say it.
Or you want to?
Well,
Go
no,
ahead.
so I think there's a concern. I heard it last night in some of the questions we received, and I'm hearing it again today, and it sort of goes back, I think, to what you were asking, is that when we're talking about these scenes and we push against the Anthropocene, is that I think the worry is that we're pushing against actors and holding people responsible. And so, and then for you that working, talking and thinking about Chemical Valley, like responsibility does come in, but part of the point I was trying to make yesterday, if you think about the fire in Houston, ITC, which I think is owned by something else, which is owned by something else, and the spokeswoman gets up and she's like, I apologize, we apologize. The company in and of itself, there is responsibility there. It will have to do cleanup. There were toxins released into the air, all sorts of things. But responsibility is also, it's also quite diffuse. And that's why I said, one of the chemicals was nail polish, the stuff that goes into nail polish remover. So the complicity of how many of us in this room who use or have used nail polish and nail polish remover. And so I think we have to sort of walk, I think we do have to think about responsibility and who's responsible, but but not in a sort of anthropogenically limited way in terms of a singular or a singular corporation, and whether or not that corporation is human. But there are broader sets of responsibilities, and I think it's how maybe do we tackle both of those things. Yeah. So.
I'm an assistant professor of ethnomusicology in School of Music here. I have a question about methodology, and it's going to get really specific, but as I ask this question, I'm thinking of Hurley's very early question about decolonizing academic work in various ways, and I'm thinking of your question about shifting analytics. And also what you were just saying right now, Shona, about nail polish remover even. Like, there's a way in which when we're thinking about the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene, we're imbricated in that in a way, and we take different approaches to standing outside it or kind of suspending our imbrication in it and looking in. And I'm thinking too of anthropologist Elizabeth Covenelli writing something about, I think she's writing about toxicity, but she says something about when we're thinking about toxicity in particular, we're standing at once, like, we're thinking at once about everywhere and nowhere. And so I guess my question is to do with the kind of balance between subject and lens and object, and how to deal with those questions. Like when I hear you, Michelle, talking about the Technoscience Lab and using critical indigenous studies or critical indigenous perspective to look at that, I think that those methods and genealogies are easily marked, and we can see what they are. Like you're kind of drawing those genealogies and talking about the specificity of place and fashioning that into a lens to look at something else entirely, whereas I think often people will assume that critical Indigenous studies is to look at Indigenous peoples in some way, and there's a kind of resistance to that. And I guess I'm wondering if you all think there is a call in some way to make more explicit the genealogies of methods in general. So for example, like thinking about right relations when we're doing histories that are seemingly not marked, but obviously come from a place and not nowhere. I don't know if that's clear. Is that a clear question?
I'm not sure it's a clear question, but I can bounce off of it. I thank you for raising all of that. So, you know, one thing in terms of trying to, you know, one debate we have at the lab is whether or not we're doing anti-colonial work or decolonial work. Are we taking, are we primarily about disassembling some colonial relations? And, what is the difference between a decolonial and an anti-colonial? One of my colleagues at the University of Toronto is Innuga scholar Eve Tuck, and she's a wonderful methodologist. Another scholar and person who I've also am trying to learn with is Max Liberon, who's a Métis scientist and also a methodologist. And so this question of, decolonial methodology, one of the things that I'm trying to think through is possible scales of decolonial projects. And so one of the kind of what I feel like I'm capable of doing or can begin to figure out, working in a university, doing, what we do, is a very small scale, right? It's a scale of stopping, it begins with refusal, right? It's the beginning with an anti-colonial gesture, refusing, taking apart something, right? And then trying to step into something else. So in doing that, it's not that all the other parts aren't still like attached to you and part of your responsibility. I don't have a fantasy that I'm escaping my colonial relations. In fact, I'm, as a white person, as someone who is formed through colonial relations, both as a beneficiary and as someone who's been injured by them, like they make me. They make me, and I can't not be that. And part of the project is how to be in ethical relation when that is how you're constituted, right? So that's like, in a way, that's like the impossibility of the decolonial, for me at least, and at the same time, it's absolute necessity. And so like in terms of methodology, this is not like the methodology of like changing the whole planet or like systems change, but it's a question of like method at the university, method in my research, or method in my lab, method in when it comes to land protection, which is beginning with a refusal, and then activating the something else. And that something else can be something that is already there, right? So like indigenous, so, if we take decolonial projects in Toronto, it has to begin with indigenous sovereignty and land and activating the governance and the responsibilities that are already there. And then there's the something else that is invention, the something else that is the responsibilities that come out of that particular place and time that is creative and made with the community that you're making your life support in. So that's how I think about it. It's a kind of a decolonial methodology that does not see harm reduction as less than decolonial. So that's just where I'm at in terms of like just trying to be at a university, make a lab, work with people, deal with chemical exposures. It's not a universal prescription, but it's maybe part of an interesting question about method.
So I have 4 people on the list: Pablo, you, Mario, and Frederic. Others that I haven't gotten. Okay, and we have 15 minutes. So I ask your questions, comments
Do we
to
want to
be.
take a couple questions at once? Or?
Are you sure?
Yeah, I think that Nadia just asked my question in a better way.
Okay, all right. So Pablo, yeah, Frederic.
Thank you for this conversation. It's marvelous. It's very rich, and I'm very happy to be here today.
Frederic, can you introduce yourself?
I am Frederic. I am Frederic Mera. I'm teaching at UW-Madison in the collapsing department of comparative literature. But it's a metonymy of the word. So my question maybe, I don't know exactly how to frame it, and I would like to come back to the concept of land. It is a central concept, right? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking something like, okay, maybe we should say, or it might be interesting to say, that a land is never only a land. That is to say, maybe it's not possible to define it as an accumulation of objects or beings, even if we say that these beings are interconnected, or even if we say that there is no great divide between non-humans and humans. And to say that a land is never only a land means that there is always an excess that cannot be territorialized in the land. And for me it is important to say that because I think we are in a massive moment of re-territorialization. That is to say, what is at stake nowadays is to protect one place, one lake, one people, and for good reasons we need to do that. But 2 questions: A, is it enough to say that? Because some people also want to protect their country against Europa, for example, or against foreigners, or against Muslims, right? So there is this kind of massive moment of re-territorialization, during which the main motto is to protect the territory, or to protect the domain, or to protect the country, or to protect the land. So, in order to avoid what seems, at least for me, a political catastrophe, we need to find in the land something that does not belong to the land, something that can be shared or translated with other lands, other places, other countries. I think that if we don't find a way to translate a land into another land, we lose everything. We can protect a place for a moment, certainly, but in the end we will lose. So my question will be about that, about this excess, about something that is not only defined by the point of view of domination or exploitation, because the history that we heard about today is a history of destruction. What was done, what was dominated, plantations, destructions, exploitations. But if we are not able to also produce the history of what was not done, what was not written, all these dreams that were prevented from existing because of exploitation, if we, okay, I'm lost, so I stopped in. Thank you.
Are we collecting?
Yeah, maybe we should collect, yeah. So, Mario?
So I'm going to give a different version of Frederick's question, using an old-fashioned term, which is the term ideology. In your talk, Michelle, you talked about gaslighting, and you talked about habit, you talked about conversion. And I wonder if the category of ideology is important to your work, and whether that helps us think about this question of agency that we were talking about before. And by ideology, I mean sort of the way in which history is naturalized, in which the production of certain subjects become sort of naturalized.
Pablo? Okay, so why don't we take these two then? Territorialization, land, and ideology.
So I'll be really brief. So to the first question, I think that there are other models. I think that there are other models and ways of thinking about land that are operative right now. I mean, so what we can see and not see is the border wall, right? And the idea of protecting that space. You know, we see migrants being, you know, turned away at sea and all sorts of things. And again, that's in the service of protecting land. But with the recent Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, that to me wasn't a struggle about territory, right? It wasn't about protecting territory, and the concept that I think we don't spend enough time on is what it means. A part of that struggle was articulated in the language of water is life. That's an entirely different of the idea of the land in terms of flows, movement, connectedness. And so I think those things, those ways of thinking about the land are already there. We just have to sort of see them. And yes, ideology is important.
I think they're both great questions, Frederic. I think maybe James O'Connor is useful in this argument, who the great sort of Marxist economist, and so for O'Connor, capitalism degraded the conditions of reproduction, and so the class struggle, broadly conceived, would move to the domain broadly defined reproductive justice struggles, as Michelle says, or social reproduction struggles, as others say. And we indeed see this. I think that the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle can be conceptualized not just as land defense, as you point out, but also reproductive justice. I think that we see the flashpoints of the class struggle in the United States around teachers and nurses. Not for nothing, the nurses led the split in the American labor movement around the Dakota Access Pipeline. So that seems to me very, very, you know, an important idea to play around with and experiment with. And then I think we're all Gramscians now, right? And we have to. But let me say this: we have to stop. I'm gonna encourage all of you to stop using the word to naturalize, because that means nature doesn't have a history. Nature has an important history in that double register, right?
But nature's naturalized itself.
That's right. Well, it's eternalized, right? That's the bourgeois invention, and I think maybe you were saying this: the invention of nature is itself as an eternal construct into which most human beings were deposited and dispossessed of their land and their lives, and put to work cheaply as a result. So that's an ongoing process. So for me, when I talk about cheap nature, it's not only the political economy moment, but it's a kind of anti-imperialist Gramscian feminist moment of how do we understand that double ethico-political and politico-economic register. And yeah, there's more, but that seems to me something fundamental to play around with.
You know, I guess I'm mostly just want to agree with what Shona said, which is that there are already other understandings of land. So we're using land, you know, on Anishinaabe we can say like Aki, we can talk about, there's other languages that really help us to have a different understanding of that relation. When I say land-body relation, I don't mean that there's land and then there's bodies, but that it means your body is land, that the land is where future body is. And so this kind of understanding about land is so different And of course, it's like on the territory that I'm working on the where I am, but there's lots of other worlds that have different relations to land. And so I think your question is really important. And this is, you know, what I think when I say land defense, right? It can be like reduced to like, oh, that's NIMBYism. You know, and I would say that's like a real misrecognition of what land defense is about. Absolutely, water is life. Water is life is central to Anishinaabe and Métis land defense. The Anishinaabe word for water is nebe, to be towards oneself. Water does not just sustain forms of life, it is its own life. The category of life and not life that we import into a certain English language of land is its own problem. And so I think you're right to say, like, plantation is great for putting land into our conversation, and then we can ask that question, like, well, what is land? And so thank you.
I will ask my question very briefly. First, thank you so much. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. So it's a question about the binaries, right, and the sort of genealogies of some of that we have been discussing. And it's been striking to me that, you know, throughout all of our conversation over these past days, the issue of organization and class within these groups, right, like, seems to be lost. And this is something that you brought up a little bit yesterday. And I think we didn't get into it. And I'm asking this because obviously the histories of violences, right, and even the ways in which we think about these groups, right, indigenous groups, or people of African descent, they also come from specific ways of dividing not only nature, culture, and human beings, but a specific way of thinking about it. But within those categorizations, the issue of the violences that they are also inherent, right, to those long histories. Amerindian slavery, for instance, in the Caribbean, is a history that does not start uniquely with the arrival of Europeans, right? And there are specific differences also within the nature and the histories of people of African descent throughout, you know, those 500 years, right? Like, and this is obviously something that in Latin American studies and Latin American history is central because of the conflicts, right, and the uneasy way in which post-colonial theory kind of fits within. Because, you know, in many ways, Latin Americans, we inhabit both the conqueror and the conqueror and the conquested. So I just want you to reflect a little bit on that kind of briefly. How does, you know, how do you deal with that? And this goes back to that uncomfortable state that I think we need to have, right, in trying to methodologically deal with it, right?
How do we live with the contradiction?
No, well, I mean, no. How do you, the issue of class, we can talk briefly about. This is something that we have not discussed much today.
I feel like people are afraid to talk about class. I once did it in a presentation, and I was called bloodless. Because I think class reshapes the question about responsibility in many different ways. And I think it's central to the discussion. Class formation is obviously central to capital formation, but I'm not sure how we do it.
Well, Sidney Mintz famously published an essay asking, was the plantation slave a proletarian? And Mintz, in his inimitable way, said, well, a little bit yes, a little bit no. But it's clear, in my view, that modern slavery is one of the most dramatic forms of proletarianization. And indeed, if we want to talk about the Plantationocene, that is the model through which we get class formation in a very, very intriguing way, but also a long history of capital formation and organizational innovation that leads to Manchester and then to Detroit and then to Shenzhen and all the everything that goes with that. I mean, for me, my own lineage comes from a kind of anti-colonial communist internationalism. People probably don't read. Do people read Claudia Jones, the Communist Party? Yeah, Claudia Jones, who was really the communist, the chief Communist Party USA theorist of women, race, and class in the 1940s, who was brilliant. And it seems to me that that is, for me, the spirit of that is to understand that at every point, those bundles of relations that are shifting in messy, contentious, and contingent ways, combined ways across the capitalist world ecology, are always embedded in webs of life and in arguments around civilization and savagery, nature and society. And so there's no need to get into the silly old debates of which is more important, because we know they're entangled. But they're not just entangled, they're mutually relational. And so I think that we have to put that at the center with all the rest of it. And I think that these days, yeah, it's become very fashionable to talk about all sorts of struggles besides class struggles, but almost all of these struggles that we've talked about are class struggles as well. And that's part of the stories that we need.
But I think part of the issue, though, is that class points us to consumption. And who consumes and what they consume and how we consume the bodily labors of others. And I think that's the thing that people don't want to get to and they don't want to talk about. So.
I think they need the room. So please join me in thanking all.